afternoon. My name is Ndugu Yusuf M. Chaney, and I'll be sitting in for Al McFarlane on today's program. Thank you for joining us. We would like to remind our listeners and viewers that if they go to YouTube on the internet and search for Insight News or The Conversation with Al McFarlane, they can subscribe to the program and help us build our audience. We would really appreciate your support in doing that. Today, we have an incredible program that I think you'll find quite informative. This coming Friday is Earth Day, April 21st, 2023. And the community is invited to take part in a Community Environmental Justice Expo, which we're going to be talking about on today's program. Our guests are Michael Chaney from Project Sweetie Pie, Britt Howell, a plant-based nutrition educator, and Kieren Morris, who is with Midwest Farmers of Color and BF50 Indigenous Health Initiative. So I'd like to invite them into the program with us at this point. Good afternoon and welcome.
Good day to you, my friend.
Michael, it's always good to see you. For years, you have been involved in providing affordable housing, in working around community health and food initiatives. So I think it is natural that you be one of the principal instigators in this effort. And I'm also pleased to have this opportunity to meet and interact with Kieren Morris and with Britt Howell as well. So welcome to the three of you. Michael, you're involved with Sweetie Pie. Can you tell us what that is?
Sure. North Minneapolis is going green. Give us a call and learn what we mean. Where once lie urban blight, now sits luscious garden sites. Gardens without borders, classrooms without walls, architects of our own destinies, access to food, justice for all. And now, like sweet potato vines, our missions and goals all intertwined. Thanks for having us on the show today, Yusuf. I've been an activist and organizer. I started way back in the early years of the 70s, actually with you, Yusuf, and doing radio and doing journalism.
And Juneteenth, don't forget.
Well, Juneteenth came even after that. Every 10 years, I come up with a good idea. In the 80s, it was Juneteenth. I was the founder, executive director of that for 18 years. In the 90s, I was the founder of the Wendell Phillips Credit Union, spent about 5 years with that. And then in 2010, when North High came under attack, myself and others, Dr. Rose Brewer, Rose McGee, Sam Grant, Metric Giles, Melvin Giles, we were all part of a group called Afro Eco. And we were sitting around commiserating about the threatened closing of North High because we knew that the killing of the school is, ultimately the killing of a community. So in all good consciousness, we could not sit back passively and watch that happen. And so, what do activists do? They get active. And so approached North High. There'd been a green room that had been fallow for about 10 years, going back to the days of Hutchinson and folks who had really felt that life skills wasn't critical to our community. And so they cut much of the funding. So this green room had been sitting empty. I approached the school and asked them, if I could get the youth growing vegetables, could I utilize the space? They agreed, and thus Project Sweetie Pie was born. The story of a community that came together, worked together for the common good of the youth and families of its community, for it takes a village to raise a child.
And Sweetie Pie is one of the sponsors of the Community Environmental Justice Expo on Friday. Now, Britt, I mentioned earlier that you are a plant-based nutrition educator and also the founder of BF50 Indigenous Health Initiative and also a member of Farmers of Color Coalition. How long have you been engaged in plant-based nutrition education, and how did you get involved in it?
Well, I started plant-based education in 2002. I started a program called Britt Fit 50, which is, the acronym for BF50 Indigenous Health. I've been involved in plant-based eating since childhood. It came from, having diabetes in our family and health problems. And I just wanted to find a different way to eat. So I started off that way. And then I went back to school, studied fitness and nutrition, and have been basically doing plant-based education. I'm an organic farmer. And then I became a certified Native American seed saver in 2015.
And where do you farm at?
So I farm with Minneapolis Park and Recreations. I'm the community garden lead at a farm called Bridalville in Prospect Park, southeast Minneapolis.
Sure. Very good. Very good. And I mentioned earlier that Kieren Morris is with Midwest Farmers of Color and is also involved with Sweetie Pie. Kieren, tell us a bit about Midwest Farmers of Color.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Midwest Farmers of Color is at this point a collectively structured network. So it's bringing together farmers largely from Minnesota, Wisconsin, and some folks in Iowa. And basically, we're identifying points of collaboration, trying to figure out what resources can be shared, what connections can be shared. We just facilitated an event in February that was basically a convening. So folks came from out of town and we met. We talked about how the collective itself should be structured. We talked about what kind of support, what resources folks could use, and then, worked internally to figure out how best to shape our strategy going forward. So at this point, Midwest Farmers of Color is a sort of support and connection network for farmers of color, and particularly emerging farmers who are just kind of getting into the game now.
On a side note, over the past couple of decades, there's been a tremendous amount of pressure placed on the United States Department of Agriculture because farmers of color have not been even on their radar. And we have lost so much land that was formerly held by Black farmers and other farmers of color. Are you seeing an increase in the support, the resources, and the collaboration with the USDA and organizations such as your own working with farmers of color?
I think that that's a really good question. Right now is a time when farming, and specifically urban farming, is, I think, experiencing a flux. And so there is, on an institutional level, some support, but that's why we just actually had folks in Washington, both folks like Michael from our coordination team, but also the farmers we work with, so that they can be there to engage with lawmakers and lobby groups towards getting more support. I think that, it is a field that's only deepening. I mean, Michael will tell you the lengths that they've had to go to get urban farming and farmers of color who are looking to get involved with it, any kind of recognition within some of these higher level groups. So I would say it's a yes and no kind of situation.
Now, are you focusing primarily on urban farming, or does farmers of color involve any farmers or all
farmers? Yeah, I think that, being based within the Twin Cities, there's a lot of urban farming organizations that we just have these inherent ties with, and there is a very strong local network. But we're also working with folks out in Cambridge, folks who are in the Driftless region in Wisconsin. So it varies. But at the end of the day, I think that, folks both in rural areas and in the cities are starting to share and cultivate these ideas of collective action and, resource sharing and opportunity development.
Now, with my collard and mustard greens and strawberries and peppers and the few vegetables and fruits that we grow in our 8 by 20 foot garden in the backyard, would that qualify me for membership in Farmers of Color, or do I need to step up my game?
No, I mean, I think that's the thing. It's like right now we're actually crafting, some micro grants that we're going to be giving out to folks. And all you really need to, apply is to be a farmer of color or a gardener of color, even like yourself. We're really geared at, helping folks cultivate their growing ability no matter what level it's going into. But I think that, the community engagement aspect of it is what's really important, because you can really grow a lot in, a space the size of yours if you have the information and the resources and the support. And that's what we're looking to give people.
Okay. And are you going to have a table at the event on Friday?
Midwest Farmers of Color won't have a table, but Zoe, who's another member of the coordination team, will be there representing Zoe Holloman. She's an amazing organizer. She has a BIPOC-based farm herself called Root Springs, where they do retreats and whatnot. So she's really been instrumental in helping guide the collective, and she's going to be there and making connections.
Okay. Before we cut to the chase, I want to acknowledge Michelle Madison, who is a frequent viewer and listener, and thank her for joining us. Good afternoon, Michelle. We're happy to have you with us as always. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Community Environmental Justice Expo, which is a coalition building and networking event hosted by multiple organizations, is going to take place this Friday. Where's it going to be held, Michael?
Well, it's going to be held at the University of Minnesota, at the Humphrey. And it's really, the environmental movement has really been in a gated community, an apartheid movement. And so we've been very intent over the last 10 years of Project Sweetie Pie of really attacking, bringing the fight to the university's front door. Why? Because it's a land grant institution. And so your tax dollars, my tax dollars, Kieren's, Britt's tax dollars are really what is keeping that university profiting and moving forward with their educational format there. And yet, as you know, in the 90s when the General College was disbanded, there's been very little return on our investment. And so that's really been my focal point, and the focal point of Project Sweetie Pie is that are we getting our fair share of the pie? And so bring in the game. If you can't bring the mountain to the Buddha to the mountain, you bring the mountain to the Buddha. And so we are actually have challenged the university. I have a number of interns from the Institute on the Environment and interns from McAllister. Three things that we do, Youssef, that I think make us very unique. Number one, our goal is to really help those who have been left out of the American dream, bringing them into the conversations, bringing them around the table so they too can, see life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Number two, we've been intent on tearing down the silos of Western culture that pits us against each other, that really diminishes the value of the work that people, kind of a divide and conquer kind of strategy. And so we've been real intent of really trying to change the cosmology from this individualism of Western culture to really think about how can we all, if we're all well-intentioned, let's be more intentional. And then last but not least, as exhibited through our work in the Upper Harbor Terminal, how do we go about changing, doing a paradigm shift where local land development, particularly when it entails public dollars, how can we really do development from the grassroots up rather than the way that it's been historically, which has been a top-down, very oppressive, biased, and like I said before, gated approach that has left us out of the picture, and we are trying to change that. One quick note, you mentioned at the head of the show, Earth Day. Earth Day is actually Saturday, the 22nd. We're doing this event on the 21st because, again, even university students are isolated, are insulated from the community, and we want to show them and show the broader community that there's resources, there's assets in them, their hills, and we need to be intent on, once again, getting our fair share of the pie.
So the Community Environmental Justice Expo takes place this Friday, April 21st, at the Hubert H. Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs on the West Bank campus of the University of Minnesota from noon to 3 p.m. Let me ask a question of each of you. What impact do you hope to have as a result of this event, given that it's being held here in the Twin Cities? Don't all speak at once.
I'll start.
Go ahead.
Well, one of the things that when Michael and I discussed this entire thing, Michael contacted me in November of 2022 with this idea. And one of the things that he talked about is that we can sit in a room all day and have conversation around the environment, climate change, plant-based education, all of those things. But if we're not reaching the masses, then what are we really doing? If we're all working in silos, we're not reaching out to the folks who need to hear about the work that we're doing. And one of the accomplishments that we hope to have is so that, it's really important to be seen and to be heard, right? In order to bring some of this together, it takes funding. So what I hope will happen is we start to reach some of those funders. So instead of them constantly and continuously giving the funding to folks who may or may not be serving the communities that Michael, myself, and Kieren work in, we're hoping that some of that money can come our way because we are working in those green zones. We're working in cultural corridors, folks who actually need folks like us to represent them. So that's one of the big things we hope that we can do in terms of reaching people. And the other thing is reaching people, right? We want to reach folks and so they can see what intentional programming actually looks like, right? So that is the big hope that, we're hoping that we reach folks who actually need to hear about this programming. There are many people who may or may not even know that Michael himself has all of these farms on the north side and beyond. They may not even know about that. There are folks who don't know that there are community gardens that cater to and reaching out to communities of color. So if they don't have land, they can come and plant their garden right there in a Minneapolis Park and Recreation Garden. So all of these things are necessary. And so we're hoping that we reach those people that absolutely matter.
Kieren, what do you hope to gain?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Well, I tend to think about these things on like macro and micro scales, I think about, because I studied history at the University of Minnesota myself, so it's a little bit of a full circle coming back and doing an event there. So, when I think about things from a macro scale, it's like we're really at a crossroads make or break moment, I think, in terms of society and climate and, the environment and all of the different things that we're going to be discussing, food systems. There are places in the US where people's food security and especially their nutritional security are under threat. We're seeing these extreme weather events happening all over the place that are causing real damage to communities. And we also have, situations like the roof depot demolition in East Phillips and South Minneapolis and the incinerator that's adjacent to North Minneapolis that are causing, direct bodily medical harm to people.
Sure.
So our relationship with, ourselves and the world is really in flux. And what Michael does with art and with community organization and what Britt does with, nutrition and with creating cultural spaces, it's like, that's what we really need right now to cultivate. And like Britt was saying, people don't know that these opportunities exist. People don't know that other groups working in these areas exist. And the fact that, we're able to get 50 organizations to come table and representatives from countless more to just show up and walk around and talk and meet people, we're really taking these issues that exist in isolation and throwing them into the stew pot and, hoping that we can get something cooking. And like, I haven't been in the game nearly as long as these folks, but I really got involved because of George Floyd's murder and the aftermath and like the direct, cultural shock that had on food systems, on people's mental health, on policy, on, you know, obviously everything that's followed with law enforcement. So it's like, this is a time, you know, to act, but also to heal and to ponder. And we're going to make a space where all that stuff can happen. So that's the macro. But then when we look at the micro scale, it's like all this stuff is so big. These issues are so complicated. And how do you get involved personally? I mean, the easiest pathway is to put another person in front of you who can have a conversation with you about what they're doing and how you can help. So I think that's really what I hope to achieve, is like building on all of this momentum that we've had to have this event that can be a really great kind of, you know, mixer, idea blender time. But then through these connections, because Britt's going to have many more events. Michael and I are going to do many more events. And the connections we make, it's like, you came down, you know, on the 21st of April. Do you want to come down again in June? Or can we come to your thing? You know, it's just another domino in the line, but it's a big one, I think.
Michael, you started farming in western Wisconsin decades ago. What can people who come to the expo on Friday between 12 and 3 at the Humphrey Institute expect? Who are some of the speakers going to be? What are some of the opportunities that are going to be available for people to get better informed, to tie into resources, to begin to join and support and share with other people working on the same objectives?
Well, you know, people ask me if I'm a grower, and I say, yeah, I grow, but that's not really what I'm doing. I say, I consider myself an ag patriot. What does that mean? That means that I'm using agriculture as the tools of my trade, that I'm really trying to grow civic and cultural engagement using agriculture, i.e. urban farms, gardening, as our field of play. And as African Americans, agriculture is in our DNA. In the turn of the century, you talk about Western Wisconsin, the turn of the century, my grandfather, a black man, owned over 1,000 acres in around the Spooner, Wisconsin area. And it was because him and a bunch of other African Americans, you know, had heard about this rich farmland in northern Wisconsin. They all came, but ultimately over the years, they all left. And as they left, my grandfather would buy their land from them. And so DNA is in my blood. It is in our blood as African Americans. And because as we brought the collard seeds to this country from Africa, you know, we brought agriculture to this country as well. And so it's important that we do not lose sight of our heritage, of that historical fact, and that we don't fall prey to the myth, right? That African Americans, people of color, aren't concerned about the environment. You know, that we don't get involved in these big issues, that it's really led by the white intellectual elite. And when I first started doing this work, I challenged that lie, that myth, because if that was true, then who was Will Allen? Will Allen, for those of you listening audience don't know, was the grand poobah of urban farming in this country from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and started an organization called Growing Power. If that was the case, who indeed, were all of these folks that have contributed historically to urban ag, and more importantly, we know that with the increase of global warming, climate change, right, that much of the federal dollars of the future will be going to address global warming and climate change. And so the future is now. It's important that we start strategizing for that future, that we start determining not only how it is that we address food access, because as you know, Youssef, that wars are fought and won or lost over food supply. So food access is only just a small component of this much larger aspirations and goals. I'm not an advocate for hunger solutions, which is white philanthropy, which, and rather than give a man a fish, I want to believe that it's important that we teach a man how to fish. And so I like to say that urban farming, local food production, is the latest iteration of the civil rights movement. We shouldn't be asking Minneapolis public schools, can we get a contract? We shouldn't be asking St. Paul public schools, can we get a contract? The same kids that are eating that food ought to be growing that food and ought to be receiving remuneration for their efforts. And so if we put our money where their federal government's mouth is, if they really, in this Biden administration, he has two top priorities. One is urban farming and agriculture, and the other one is equity and inclusion. We fit both of those bills, again, and even looking at the Pickford lawsuit, for your listeners that don't know about that, that was that large federal class action suit that happened in the 80s, happened in the 90s, where because Black farmers and farmers of color, historically, as you referred to earlier, Youssef, that we weren't granted funds, that we were slowly ostracized and burdened, and lost much of the land mass that our forefathers had as farmers of color. And so given now even the Land Justice Act that Cory Booker, Senator Tina Smith, and Klobuchar are authors of, we see this kind of massive white oppression where white farmers came out in opposition and did all kinds of class action suits to really stall that legislation, which was about really leveling the playing field. So it's critical that, if you don't, instead of us getting run over by the bus, let's get ahead of the train and let's make sure that those green jobs, those green opportunities, that we don't see a repeat of what we've seen in the construction industry, in the road maintenance industries, where we've been boxed out of those careers and those professions. We're intent on really introducing the next generation of urban farmers and the changing face of agriculture. That is the task before us.
Okay, before I point out that we've faced this opposition ever since the discussion began about 40 acres and a mule for former people who were enslaved, I want to shout out to La Lupe La and thank her for joining us this afternoon as well. Greetings. But let me ask you this. The program on Friday afternoon, noon to 3, at the Humphrey Institute on the West Bank campus of the university is open to the public. But one of the primary focal points of the gathering is to encourage university students or students in higher education to learn from community-driven environmental justice initiatives in the Twin Cities area. What would that look like if it were successful?
Well, what that would look like, again, as I referred to before, right now I currently have 4 students from the University of Minnesota who have been critically important working with Britt and Kieren on the creation, marketing, promotion, co-creation, co-design, and co-curating that space. And so call this a matchmaking event where we're trying to bring community leaders, a leadership of color, but environmental organizations at large. There's a lot of trauma around the planet, even among young people, about global warming and climate change. And people, the average layperson, there's really no point of entry for them to really get into the conversation, let alone trying to figure out how do we deter some of this existential threat called global warming, climate change. So as leaders, as thought leaders, as academicians, as nonprofit shepherds, it's critical that we open the floodgates, that we really provide people direction, and that we invite the next generation of future leadership. It's not even just about It's really about training the next generation of young people of color, young allies, white allies, so that they're more culturally sensitive, that they understand and debunk the myth that somebody like Britt exists, that a young leader like Kieren, that they only see themselves in the mirror, and so consequently the mythology percolates that well, I'll use Donald Trump's metaphor. Only I and I alone can fix this. How absurd, how ridiculous, what a lie. And so we are debunking the myth, and we're inviting all these young people to come and give support to Britt and her efforts, to join Kieren in some of his visionary work that he's deployed, and to come and join and leave the campus. You're not a slave. You're not chained to the University of Minnesota. You are yet and still a community member, and come and partner with and learn directly from the indigenous leaders of this community. And with that, let's march forward like I said, if we're all intentional, let's be intentional in terms of putting forth some initiatives. We're really about operationalizing the Green New Deal. We're really about operationalizing COP26 in terms of sustainable development goals of the UN. And so those things don't happen, by accident. There has to be, just like in the civil rights movement, there has to be some visionary leadership, some futuristic leadership that is really, as in the civil rights movement, crafting that agenda, putting that agenda forward, and figuring out how do we come to mutual support. And so I look to the civil rights movement for much of my mentorship, in terms of some of the work and some of the public displays that we're taking forth, and we're taking pages out of the playbook of the civil rights movement.
Okay. Kieren, Britt, your microphone is muted, Britt. Who are some of the other sponsors who are helping to implement the program on Friday at the Humphrey Institute?
Yeah, well, I think to Michael's point about emerging leaders, one thing that has been really cool is that we also have some students from McAllister, Ben and Isaac, who have been working with us on various things, from the actual list of attendees to the graphic design and just implementation of the media around it and everything. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really cool to see, these institutions of higher learning working in concert to support community design efforts like this. So to have, students from the U of M and students from McAllister in the same room with folks who have been doing this work in the community for decades is kind of epitomizing what Michael was talking about. One thing I wanted to say really quick, and then Britt, I'd love to hear from you too, but on the flip side, right, we want to get students out into the community. We also want to get the community into the facilities that the U of M offers, because, I went there. They have a lot of state-of-the-art facilities. They have space for growing on campus. They have lots of groups in the community that are already doing this work. And so to bring down some of those gates and allow folks in addition to getting the students out, is also a goal of this, I think. I just wanted to add that.
Sure. Britt?
So I just want to add, some of the sponsors who are partnering with us on this this Friday. We have, of course, we have the Institute on the Environment, which are the students that's helping put this together. We have AMPACT, USDA, Minnesota 350, Minneapolis Park and Recreation. We even have Ward 2 Councilmember Robin Wansley and her staff. They will be present that day. Environmental Initiative and BF50 Indigenous Health is supported by Minnesota Humanities Center. So as you can see, we have some really great names, and some would say big names, coming out to support this initiative. So that pretty much goes to show you how important it is. And I think Kieren may have tapped on it, that we have over 50 organizations. And honestly, we had to turn organizations down in terms of tabling, but we invited them to come out and still network because we ran out of space. So that goes to show you that this is a really important event. We have Edible Gardens Boulevards, which is led by Michelle Shaw. I think she may be in the room today as well, but there's a lot of organizations who are really behind this movement. And I'm just happy to see that all these folks are here and ready to support this.
Okay. Michael, let's circle back to Project Sweetie Pie, because your efforts at urban farming or urban gardening are taking place throughout the Twin Cities. Tell us more about Project Sweetie Pie, and tell us who some of the people are that you're working with, communities, organizations in the Twin Cities in terms of urban gardening or urban farming.
Well, you have two of the critical allies and supporters on the show here today with me. So, and that in fact is why they're here. But Kieren is part of AMPAC. AMPAC is AmeriCorps that deals with Reading Corps, Math Corps, Climate Corps. And so we really try to, how do we build a movement if we don't even know who's on first and who's on second? We've been running around like Keystone Cops because we haven't really taken the time to really do an inventory of skills or identify who are the stakeholders. So Project Sweetie Pie, like I said, actually, Youssef, we created the first urban farm legislation in the nation in partnership with the Minnesota Department of Ag. Any farmer or any organization, nonprofit, faith-based community that wants to train the next generation of horticulturalists or agriculturists can apply to a grant through the Minnesota Department of Ag. It's called the Agri Grant, and you can receive up to $50,000 worth of seed money. And when we first approached the legislative, the House Finance, Ag House Finance, they asked us, they said, well, Michael, what is urban farming? We said it's farming in urban areas. Well, they didn't want to believe us because, we were a ragtag bunch of misfits. So they had to do a commission. They hired a consultant. They spent about $250,000, and it came back, and survey says urban farming is farming in urban areas. So we still have to, as they say, we're always the last hired and the first fired, but we've really made, as they said back there, the Republicans said, well, Michael, this is cutting edge legislation. And we were about 7-8 years ahead of ourselves. Now there's a urban farm national office just opened up in St. Paul. The Farm Service Agency just opened up a farm service office, urban farm office that Metric Giles is involved with in St. Paul. He's a leader in St. Paul. Everybody knows the Urban Ag Alliance over there. And so, again, it's really about mobilizing and energizing communities to realize that this is not just about food access, but it's about economic development. It's about human development. It's about youth development. It's about community development. And so urban farming is, an ideal gateway drug to really bringing young people forward. So we're partnering, one of our partners and the sponsors of this event is the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Services. Project Sweetie Pie was selected one of 17 cities across the United States to represent Minnesota in an initiative that they call the People's Garden. And so we've received funding for the next 2 years to do this initiative. And so we've wedded it to, about 10 years ago, I created myself, Myron Green, and Ed Irwin, we created a food program that's been in existence for the last 10 years, 3 days a week. People from the community can come to Oak Park Neighborhood Center and they can get a home-cooked, nutritious meal. One of our earliest proteges from Project Sweetie Pie has now grew up in that system, and she's now the head chef taking care of that program. So it's been a decade, and we've seen some of the young people that have been part of Project Sweetie Pie. Every year we partner with the city of Minneapolis. This year we'll have about 20 youth who will work, around all of this. Right now, we've got about 15 gardens throughout North Minneapolis, and it's our job to train these young people in horticultural skills, how to grow their own food, how to cook their own food, and how to serve that food to the community. So we're very proud of the accomplishments that we made. Another big initiative is that we're in partnership with Elon Musk's brother, Kimball Musk. And a couple years ago, he had what he called the Million Garden Challenge. We applied and we were the winners of that award. And after we did the event, we were asked to become part of a governance board. It's called the Big Green DAO. And so we've actually deploying resources. That $1 million grew to $6 million. And it's a fund for BIPOC organizations across the United States that are doing good deeds. We identify them, and then we try to give them the much needed funding so that they can not only grow or survive, but thrive.
For people in the audience who aren't familiar, BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. And if you joined our program this afternoon in progress, I'm Youssef M. Chaney, sitting in for Al McFarlane today and hosting the program. And with me are Britt Howell, a plant-based nutrition educator, who is the founder of BF50 Indigenous Health Initiative, Kieren Morris from Midwest Farmers of Color. Kieren is also involved with Michael Chaney in Project Sweetie Pie. And Michael Chaney has been doing this work in the community and around the country for decades. And we certainly do owe him a debt of thanks for his efforts to spread the word, to plant the seeds, because they clearly are blooming. And we've been talking about, and we'll continue for another 15 minutes, about the Community Environmental Justice Expo, which takes place this Friday, April 21st, from noon to 3 p.m. at the Hubert H. Humphrey Institute, the School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. It's on the West Bank, 12 p.m. noon to 3 p.m. this Friday. And this is a coalition building and networking event hosted by Project Sweetie Pie, the Institute on the Environment, BF50 Indigenous Health, Midwest Farmers of Color Coalition, the Nature Conservancy, Hennepin County, the University of Minnesota Green Summit, and dozens of other organizations. It's a great opportunity for education, for networking, for identifying resources, and for learning about what's happening. When we talk about community gardens or urban farming, people think of the Hmong or the Southeast Asians, who they see in many of these plots around the Twin Cities. And as you go out into the suburbs and exurbs, even on some leased land, some farms. But we also have, is it Frogtown Farm, on the location of the former Wilder Foundation on LaFond and Victoria and Milton. There are a number of individual gardens that are planted on the site where houses were torn down during the urban renewal or Negro removal phases of our community. There, we have a community garden right across the street from our house, and many people have gardens in their yards. Now, what happens with this food? Do people sell it? Do they, can it? Do they donate it to the food shelf? Do they give it away? Or exactly what in terms of the community gardens, the urban farms? And approximately, do we know how many community gardens we have in the Twin Cities metro area?
Well, as far as that statistic goes, I'm not sure, but I know it would be well into the hundreds. I mean, just about every neighborhood has, at least one. And, if not what we might think of as a large plot structured community garden, there are, one of the things that we talk about is adopt a plot, adopt a lot, adopt a garden box, which basically says that you can grow anywhere you can put stuff. So, you know, there are definitely hundreds of community gardens in the traditional sense, but I would say in terms of urban farming on a whole, you know, as we're learning, as it develops, it's such a diverse modality of creating food. But as far as where that food goes, you know, I kind of look at it like a lock and a key. So when it comes down to it, there's a lot of different challenges that communities face, economic, nutritional, health wise. And urban farming has the capability through both the actual food it creates, but also, as Michael was alluding to, the way in which it brings community together and creates further opportunities. And so, what's actually happening with the food is reflective of whatever, you know, the gaps are that need to be filled. So there's programs like Dee Dee Fuller at Oak Park, who Michael mentioned, where we're taking food directly from the garden and putting it into the meals that are cooked and then going out to people for free. But then there's also CSA programs all over the city where people sign up to have some share in a farm or just for free, and then they have boxes of produce from that farm delivered on a weekly basis. So there's lots of different forms that the actual application of the food can take. A lot of it does go to food shelves and other mutual aid sites that give it away for free. But I think one of the things that we really want to do as we move to flesh out the networks that we're creating with this event and with the other stuff we do is to create more synergy around, you know, where the food goes and making sure it doesn't get wasted and it goes to those who need it. And that also comes down to stuff like equipment sharing or work sharing, or, you know, where can we move these interns who are working here to do stuff at this community garden, you know, on this day when they need some hands. So it's it really varies where the food goes. And I think there's a natural tendency for it to move where it's needed, but we want to help, you know, steward that process and break down the silos so that we're doing it as effectively as we can, if that makes any sense.
And I want to remind people in our audience that they can go to YouTube to @Insight News MN, Minnesota, to receive notifications about when Conversation with Al McFarlane is live, and to help us build our audience. It's free, tremendous source of information. And we certainly welcome and appreciate those people who do join us whenever they are able to do that. How do issues of social, racial, and economic equity intersect with environmental justice in the Twin Cities area? Who would like to tackle that?
Michael.
Sure. Well, again, those are two of the, in the Biden administration, two of his top priorities is equity, and the other one is farming. Again, we're bringing healthy fare to the village square. So we're reinventing education. And I never talk about urban farming singularity. I always refer to it as urban farming, local food production, because we're not just talking about growing, you know, some onions and carrots, you know, for the evening meal. We're also, as we grow and as we grow together, we're also talking about value-added food, right? You know, where can we take those culturally specific foods that, you know, we're a very diverse community. Can that be reflected? And so I like to say, we'll know if we've achieved equity and inclusion if the food that sits on the shelves in our big box stores really is indicative of that. And so do we have a lot of work to do? Yes. Are we victims of a lot of, you know, marginalization? As we know, that's what low-income communities are. You know, we've been marginalized. We've been victims of institutional racism, well, at least for 400 years. And so there's much work to be done. And so that's why I'm advocating that we've been looking for love in all the wrong places in terms of looking to the USDA or in fact, Minnesota Department of Agriculture. I really think that we really have to become very progressive and really look at these community gardens, these backyard gardens, these school gardens, and I created an acronym that I call PODS, Place-Based Organizational Development Strategies. And what that translates into is how can we turn these garden sites as kind of iconic destinations, right? Stops on the Underground Railroad, and how can we turn them materially into a co-op? And so we're working to frame out what I call the United Urban Farm and Food Federation. That puts us in league and aligned with the credit union movement. It puts us in line and in sync with the community food co-ops. And so then we will have a broader bench. We will have a more invested allies where we can really start talking about how do we aggregate produce. I don't care if somebody's growing 4 tomatoes or 400 tomatoes. If we can build a distribution system that can incorporate schools, faith-based organizations, every church in our community moving into the 21st century ought to have a garden. Every church, every school moving into the 21st century ought to have a vertical farm. And with that, we're taking away that, those, no longer should we be talking about doing a bake sale. Let's put together vertical farming sites that we can actually grow year round, which is one of the big hurdles, is that you can't grow a business, let alone a green enterprise, if you're only operating within the narrow gardening season of 3 months. How do we extend the season? In Project Sweetie Pie, we say there's 4 phases of Project Sweetie Pie. Stage 1 is scattered gardens. Stage 2 is season extension. Stage 3 is social media. And stage 4, I call Pi Squared Green to the Second Power. And that's green, the development of green enterprise and green infrastructure. And if we can mobilize and become energized to create the kind of revenue stream that will incentivize people not to think about this as just a hobby, a pastime, something fun to do, grow a few little items, but in communities where there is no industry, we should be thinking about how do we take urban farming to the next level and really scale it out where we can be growing food for the local hospital systems. We can be growing food for the local school systems because we are the investors in those systems, and we should be the beneficiaries of those systems as well.
Thank you, Michael. Britt, Kieren, turn your mics on. I got a question for you. We talk about food in general, but we live in Minnesota. Minnesota has 2 seasons, winter and construction. I think we're somewhere between the 2 of them. We also have a lot of conversation about culturally appropriate foods. What type of culturally appropriate foods can people grow in this climate? And what do you encourage people to try in their backyards or in their community gardens or other accessible spaces?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, it's a very multi-level question because on the one hand, there is really a lot of stuff you can grow here. There's a lot of varieties of plants that are more acclimated to the colder climate and the soil type that we have here. And so certainly like collards, kale, and some of the other brassicas, the family that kale is in, do really good here. But also, as Michael was talking about, I think season extension is a huge thing that we want to work with in terms of developing those localized food systems. And so creating indoor growing spaces that are accessible to folks where they can continue growing into the wintertime. And, I don't know if you've ever been to the free conservatory over at Como Park, but going into a heated green growing space like that in the wintertime in Minnesota has like an immense mental health benefit as well. So creating those collectively run growing extension indoor spaces, I think could have a really nice impact on people during the wintertime when there's not a lot of green or warmth. But yeah, I would say that there's lots of places that you can plug in if you want to find out about specifically what's good to grow. The University of Minnesota also tests soil. So if you want to find out specifically what'll grow the best in your backyard, you can get them a sample, and they'll give you a full breakdown of the different nutrients in there and if there's any contaminants and how best to move forward. So there's a lot of resources.
They do that on the St. Paul campus, correct?
I believe so, yeah.
Is there a cost associated with that?
There is some cost, but I don't think it's anything super exorbitant.
Yeah. Britt, your take on culturally appropriate foods.
Well, I actually was part of an urban farm. It was the first urban production farm in Minneapolis. I helped direct the structure of the urban farm there at Little Earthling United Tribes back into 2015. And we had the ability to grow corn very well. We grew all types of squash, zucchini, greens, kale, North Carolina kale, collard. So there's a lot of different types of foods that you can grow. We grew a lot of peppers that most folks don't think will grow well here, but they do. We grew these habaneros that look very much like, if anybody's familiar with Caribbean food, and I am, if you're familiar with Scotch bonnet peppers, there's a habanero pepper. I can't think of this particular name, but it tastes very much like a Scotch bonnet. It's nice and spicy. It grows very well. I grew something 2 years ago called Armenian cucumbers. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but they look like serpents, like a snake. They grow particularly well. So there's a lot, and the teachings that I do are intentional and cultural teaching. So a lot of the foods I make are plant-based foods, but it's cultural food. So we have the ability to grow more than what we probably think we can. And in terms of the question before about what we do with the food, because I'm on Minneapolis Park and Recreation, we're not allowed to sell food. Michael doesn't like that. However, we do grow about 15 plots of food that are community driven. So all of the food that we grow in those plots go to a local food shelf right here in Prospect Park.
Good, very good. Listen, what's your website?
Yusuf, I just wanted to also add that Midwest Farmers of Color, which both me and Kieren are part of, we've just formed a partnership with Ujamaa Seeds, and it is a seed collective. Sister out in the East Coast has started, and they're actually gathering seeds from all around the globe and becoming seed savers. And so it's important that we save the seeds.
All right. Michael Chaney and Kieren Morris from Farmers of Color, and also Project Sweetie Pie. Britt Howell from BF50 Indigenous Health Initiative. Again, Friday, April 23rd, or 21st, I'm sorry, Hubert H. Humphrey Institute, 12 noon to 3 p.m., the Community Environmental Justice Expo. Check it out. And thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Yusuf M. Chaney. God bless, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.